My name is Gloria, 35 years old, and I grew up in one of Connecticut's wealthiest families. My mother, Eleanor, seemed like an ordinary housewife who spent her days cooking and caring for us. But when cancer took hold of her body, my father and siblings revealed their true colors by abandoning her completely. What they didn't know was that Mum had been keeping enormous secrets. The letters she left behind didn't just expose their betrayal. They unveiled an empire none of us knew existed. Before I share this incredible story, please tell me where you're watching from. If you've ever witnessed family betrayal or watched loved ones show their true nature during crisis, please like and subscribe, because what happened to my mother will leave you questioning everything about family loyalty. This story proves that sometimes the quietest person in the room holds the most power. Growing up in the Whitmore family meant living in a world where appearances mattered more than authenticity. Our Greenwich estate sprawled across 12 acres, with its limestone facade gleaming in the Connecticut sun. Every Thursday evening, my parents hosted dinner parties where influential people gathered to discuss mergers and acquisitions over imported wine and chef-prepared courses. To outsiders, we embodied the American dream: a successful patriarch, a devoted mother, and 4 accomplished children living in perfect harmony. My father, Richard Whitmore, built his real estate empire from a small inheritance, transforming it into a multi-million-dollar corporation. At 70, he still commanded boardrooms with his silver hair and custom-tailored suits. He measured everything in numbers, profits, and potential returns. I remember being 7 years old showing him a drawing I'd made, and he asked what practical purpose it served. That was Dad unable to see value in anything that didn't generate revenue. My eldest brother Daniel inherited more than just Dad's sharp jawline. At 42, he served as vice president of Whitmore Enterprises, married to Jennifer, a former beauty pageant winner who spent her days shopping and planning charity galas she rarely attended. Daniel learned early that money could solve any problem. When he crashed his 3rd car in high school, Dad simply bought him another one. When he nearly failed out of Yale, a generous donation suddenly improved his grades. Margaret, my only sister, turned 40 last year, though she claimed 35 to her patients at the aesthetic clinic she operated in Manhattan. She married Robert, a corporate lawyer who billed $800 an hour and still complained about being underpaid. Margaret transformed herself into everything Mother wasn't. Where Mum wore simple dresses from department stores, Margaret exclusively wore designer labels. Where Mum cooked family meals from scratch, Margaret had her housekeeper prepare everything or ordered catering. Christopher, at 38, became Wall Street's golden boy before 30. Single by choice, he claimed relationships were bad investments. He lived in a penthouse overlooking Central Park, dated models and actresses he never introduced to the family, and visited home only for major holidays or when Dad summoned him for business discussions. Chris viewed emotion as weakness, something that clouded judgment and led to poor decisions. Then there was me, Gloria, the baby of the family at 35. While my siblings chased wealth and status, I became an elementary school teacher in a public school. My family never understood why I chose to work with children who came to school hungry, wearing hand-me-down clothes. They couldn't comprehend finding joy in teaching a child to read or seeing their face light up when they finally understood fractions. I earned in a year what Christopher made in a week, but I slept peacefully every night. My mother, Eleanor, stood at the center of our family, though she occupied its margins. At 68, she moved through our enormous house like a ghost, cooking meals that often went unappreciated, maintaining traditions no one else cared about, remembering birthdays when everyone else forgot. She came from modest beginnings, the daughter of a seamstress and a factory worker. Dad met her when she served him coffee at a diner where she worked to pay for college. He said he fell in love with her smile, though I suspect he was more attracted to her beauty and compliance. Mum never complained about Dad's late nights at the office or his business trips that stretched longer each year. She didn't protest when Daniel spoke over her at dinner or when Margaret criticized her appearance. She simply smiled, refilled wine glasses, and asked about everyone's day. Only I noticed how her hands trembled slightly when Dad's voice rose, or how she stared out the kitchen window for long periods, lost in thoughts she never shared. Our house contained 22 rooms, but Mum spent most of her time in 3. The kitchen, where she prepared elaborate meals that showcased her culinary skills. Her bedroom, which Dad hadn't shared in over a decade, claiming his snoring disturbed her sleep. And a small study on the 3rd floor that she kept locked. When I asked about it once, she said it contained old photo albums and memorabilia she wanted to preserve. The key stayed on a chain around her neck, hidden beneath her modest necklaces. Strange details accumulated over the years that I alone seemed to notice. Every month, Mum received a phone call that made her lock herself in her room. She emerged with red eyes but refused to discuss it. Bank statements arrived addressed only to her, which she quickly filed away. She volunteered at a homeless shelter every Tuesday, but never mentioned it to anyone except me. When I offered to join her, she said it was something she needed to do alone. The dynamic of our family gatherings followed a predictable pattern. Dad dominated conversations with business talk. My brothers competed for his approval with their latest achievements. Margaret criticised everything from the food temperature to the flower arrangements. And Mum moved silently between kitchen and dining room, ensuring everyone's needs were met. I tried to help her, but she always insisted I sit and enjoy the meal. Looking back, I think she found peace in the kitchen's solitude, away from the performative nature of our family interactions. One Thanksgiving, when Mum had prepared a feast for 20 relatives, Dad announced a major acquisition his company had completed. Everyone raised their glasses to toast his success. No one thanked Mum for cooking since dawn. No one noticed she hadn't eaten anything, too busy refilling platters and refreshing drinks. That night, I found her sitting alone in the dark kitchen, tears streaming down her face. When I hugged her, she whispered that she loved me, then composed herself and never mentioned that moment again. The facade we maintained fooled everyone, including ourselves sometimes. We attended church on Christmas and Easter, donated to the right charities, and posted family photos that garnered hundreds of likes on social media. Margaret wrote posts about being blessed with the world's best mother while forgetting to call Mum for months. Daniel shared Father's Day tributes, white gifts, while actively working to push Dad out of his own company. Christopher sent expensive gifts instead of visiting, thinking money could substitute for presents. I chose to live differently, renting a small apartment 40 minutes away, despite family pressure to accept their financial help. My siblings mocked my second-hand furniture and ancient Honda Civic, but I treasured my independence. Every Sunday, I visited Mum for lunch. Just the two of us eating simple sandwiches while she told stories about her childhood I'd never heard before. She described growing up poor but happy, surrounded by love, if not luxury. Her eyes sparkled when she talked about her parents, both long deceased. During one of these lunches, Mum mentioned someone named Thomas. The name slipped out accidentally while she described a jazz concert she'd attended in college. When I asked about him, she quickly changed the subject, but I saw something in her expression I'd never witnessed before. A profound sadness mixed with distant longing. That night, I couldn't stop wondering about Thomas and what he'd meant to my mother. Everything changed on a cold February morning when Mum collapsed in the garden. She'd been planting spring bulbs, wanting to see flowers bloom one more time. Maria, our housekeeper, who'd worked for the family 20 years, found her unconscious among the tulip beds. The ambulance arrived within minutes, but I knew from the paramedics' expressions that something was terribly wrong. I called my siblings from the hospital waiting room, my voice shaking as I delivered news that would reveal who they really were. The diagnosis hit like a physical blow. Pancreatic cancer stage 4, inoperable. The oncologist, Dr. Patterson, delivered the prognosis with practiced compassion. 3 to 4 months, if we were fortunate, possibly less. The cancer had spread aggressively, wrapping around vital organs like invasive vines. Treatment options existed, but they would only marginally extend her time while significantly diminishing its quality. Mum sat perfectly still as he spoke, her hands folded in her lap, accepting the death sentence with more grace than anyone should possess. I crumbled, completely sobbing in the sterile hospital room while Mum comforted me. She stroked my hair like she had when I was small, whispering that everything would be all right. The irony wasn't lost on me. The dying woman consoling the healthy one. She asked me to be strong to help her through what came next. I promised her anything, everything, not knowing how that promise would change my life. When Dad arrived 2 hours later, his first words weren't about Mum's comfort or emotional state. He immediately asked about treatment costs and survival statistics. He pulled Dr. Patterson aside to discuss hiring specialists from Johns Hopkins and Mayo Clinic, treating Mum's cancer like a business problem that could be solved with enough resources. He never once held her hand or asked how she felt. He stood at the foot of her bed like a CEO, reviewing quarterly reports, emotionally detached from the woman he'd married 45 years ago. Daniel showed up that evening, still wearing his expensive suit from a client meeting he deemed too important to leave immediately. While Mum dozed from pain medication, he cornered me in the hallway to ask about her will and whether she'd updated it recently. He wanted to know about life insurance policies, property deeds, and bank accounts. When I told him to focus on Mum instead of money, he laughed and said I was too emotional to understand practical matters. His wife Jennifer sent flowers but couldn't visit because of a spa appointment. Margaret flew in from Manhattan the next day, complaining about the inconvenience of cancelling her patients. She spent 10 minutes with Mum before declaring the hospital room depressing and stepping out for fresh air that turned into a 3-hour shopping trip. She returned with bags from designer stores explaining that retail therapy helped her cope with stress. When Mum asked to see what she'd bought, Margaret said Mum wouldn't understand the brands anyway. The casual cruelty of that statement made me want to shake my sister. Christopher managed a video call from his Wall Street office, claiming an urgent deal prevented him from visiting. He spoke to Mum for exactly 3 minutes, telling her to stay strong and fight hard, using the same motivational cliches he probably used with underperforming employees. When the call ended, Mum smiled sadly and said, at least he'd made an effort. I wanted to scream that 3 minutes wasn't effort, it was an insult, but I kept quiet to preserve her feelings. The family meeting that evening took place in the hospital cafeteria. Dad led the discussion like a board meeting, outlining the diagnosis, treatment options, and logistical challenges. Margaret worried about who would handle Mum's responsibilities during treatment. Christopher participated by phone multitasking audibly with keyboard clicks and muffled conversations. Daniel had already researched home healthcare costs and presented a spreadsheet comparing different service providers. Not once did anyone mention love, fear, or grief. They approached Mum's terminal illness like a temporary inconvenience requiring strategic planning. I made my decision that night. I requested extended leave from school, explaining that my mother was dying and needed full-time care. My principal, Mrs. Henderson, hugged me and said she'd hold my position as long as possible. My colleagues organised a meal train and sent cards to Mom showing more compassion than her own family. I packed my apartment, putting most belongings in storage, and moved back to my childhood home to become Mum's primary caregiver. The first week home taught me about true intimacy. I learnt to inject morphine subcutaneously when pain consumed her. I changed surgical dressings on bed sores that developed despite our best efforts. I held her hair back when chemotherapy-induced nausea left her retching bile. I bathed her when she became too weak to stand, seeing her body's fragility while remembering its former strength. These acts of service felt sacred, allowing me to repay a fraction of the care she'd given me throughout life. Mum's decline happened in stages, each stealing another piece of her independence. First, she couldn't climb stairs, so we converted the main floor study into her bedroom. Then walking became impossible, confining her to a wheelchair. I pushed through the house so she could see her garden through different windows. Eventually, even sitting up required enormous effort. But her mind remained sharp, perhaps cruelly, so forcing her to witness her body's betrayal with complete awareness. During long afternoons when pain medication made her drowsy but not unconscious, she told me stories I'd never heard. She described meeting my father when she was 19, how handsome and ambitious he'd seemed. She'd believed his promises about building a life together, not understanding she'd become an accessory to his success rather than a partner. She spoke about raising 4 children practically alone while Dad built his empire. She never sounded bitter, just wistful for the life she'd imagined versus the one she'd lived. One evening, when spring rain drummed against windows, Mom mentioned Thomas again. This time she didn't change the subject when I asked. Thomas had been her first love, a boy from her neighbourhood who wrote poetry and played saxophone in a jazz quartet. They'd planned to marry after college, but he'd been drafted and sent to Vietnam in 1969. He died 3 weeks before his tour ended, killed in an ambush near the Cambodian border. She showed me a faded photograph hidden in her jewellery box, a young man with kind eyes and an infectious smile. She'd married my father 2 years later, but she'd never stopped loving Thomas. The revelation reframed my understanding of Mum's entire life. She'd settled for security over passion, chosen practical over romantic, accepted comfortable over authentic. Dad had offered stability and status, things that mattered to a young woman who'd grown up poor. But her heart had remained buried in a military cemetery with a boy who'd written her poems comparing her eyes to autumn leaves. I held her while she cried for a love lost 50 years ago, finally understanding the sadness I'd always sensed beneath her pleasant demeanour. As Mum weakened, she began making unusual requests. She asked me to bring her correspondence boxes from the locked room, spending hours writing letters with shaking hands. When I offered to help, she insisted on privacy. She had me contact Marcus Thompson, an attorney who'd been Thomas's best friend, scheduling meetings that left her exhausted but somehow satisfied. She transferred personal items to a safety deposit box at a bank Dad didn't use. When I questioned these activities, she simply said she was putting affairs in order. The locked room's contents surprised me when she finally gave me the key. Instead of photo albums, I found filing cabinets containing business documents, investment portfolios, and correspondence spanning decades. Mum had apparently maintained a separate financial life, completely unknown to Dad. Bank statements showed substantial balances in accounts bearing only her name. Corporate documents revealed she'd founded a consulting company that operated successfully for 20 years. This secret empire existed parallel to her role as suburban housewife and mother. By April, our house had become a monument to absence. Dad moved to the guest wing claiming Mum's medical equipment, and round-the-clock care disrupted his sleep. He left for the office before dawn and returned after midnight, avoiding any interaction with his dying wife. When he did encounter her, he spoke in the artificially cheerful tone people use with children or dementia patients, never acknowledging the intelligent woman still present behind cancer's ravages. He hired an assistant to send flowers weekly with cards signed in her handwriting. Daniel's visits dwindled to 5-minute appearances Sunday mornings. He'd stand in the doorway asking if Mum needed anything while checking his phone constantly. When she asked about his children, her grandchildren, she barely knew he provided bullet point updates like delivering a status report. His kids had sent one card clearly forced by their mother with signatures and nothing else. Daniel always had urgent meetings, critical calls, or essential business trips that prevented longer visits. Success had replaced his heart with a calculator. Margaret sent elaborate flower arrangements every week with cards containing generic messages, probably written by her assistant. She visited monthly, staying just long enough to post selfies on Instagram, with captions about cherishing family moments and the importance of being present. She'd sit beside Mum's bed, scrolling through her phone, while Mum dozed occasionally, glancing up to ensure Mum still breathed. When Mum was awake, Margaret complained about her problems, never asking about Mum's pain or fear. Christopher disappeared entirely after his initial video call. He sent expensive gifts, gourmet food Mum couldn't eat, cashmere blankets for a woman burning with fever, designer robes for someone who rarely left bed. Each package included a note saying he was thinking of her, though his thoughts never translated into presence. When Mum asked about him, I lied and said he'd called while she slept. She knew I was lying, but appreciated the effort to spare her feelings. The household staff showed more compassion than blood relatives. Maria arrived early to prepare Mum's favourite broths, even though Mum could barely swallow. James the gardener brought fresh flowers daily, describing the garden's progress, so Mum could visualise spaces she'd never see again. Even the pool maintenance man Roberto asked about her health with genuine concern. These employees paid to care for property showed more humanity than family obligated to care by blood. Mum's 69th birthday arrived in May with no fanfare from family. Dad forgot entirely, leaving for a golf tournament in Florida. My siblings didn't call or visit, but Maria baked Mum's favourite lemon cake, and I decorated her room with handmade cards from my students. We attempted celebrating, but Mum couldn't eat the cake, and exhaustion prevented opening the small gifts I'd bought. She smiled through tears, pretending joy she couldn't feel, protecting us from her disappointment even while dying. Late one evening, when morphine had dulled the pain enough for conversation, Mum told me she'd always known the truth about her family. She understood Dad's emotional absence, recognised her older children's greed, accepted their inability to love beyond themselves. She'd stayed for me, she said, knowing I needed at least one parent who prioritised heart over wealth. Her sacrifice broke something inside me, realising she'd endured decades of loneliness to ensure I didn't grow up without love. The hospice nurse Patricia visited daily by June. She'd witnessed countless deaths and developed a gentle wisdom about end-of-life realities. She told me privately that Mum had perhaps weeks, not months. The cancer had accelerated, consuming her from within like a wildfire. Patricia also mentioned that in 20 years of hospice work, she'd rarely seen such family abandonment. Usually, even dysfunctional families gathered as death approached. Our family's absence was exceptionally cruel. Mum started experiencing what Patricia called terminal lucidity periods of unusual clarity and energy before death. During these windows, she'd speak urgently about tasks requiring completion. She made me promise to deliver the letters she'd written only after her death and only when the family gathered. She insisted I contact Mr. Thompson immediately after she passed. She transferred a box of jewellery to Maria, saying she'd understand its purpose later. These preparations seemed desperately important to Mum, so I agreed to everything. One terrible night, pain medication failed to provide relief. Mum writhed in agony, crying out for death's mercy. I called Dad, begging him to come to hold her hand to provide comfort only a husband could give. He said he had an important meeting in the morning and needed sleep. I called my siblings, pleading for one of them to visit. Daniel said he was in Chicago. Margaret claimed a migraine. Christopher didn't answer. I held Mum alone through that endless night, singing lullabies she'd once sung to me, pretending my presence was enough. The next morning, Mum seemed peaceful, almost radiant. She asked me to open windows so she could smell the garden one last time. She spoke about seeing her parents, about Thomas waiting for her, about feeling ready for whatever came next. She told me I'd been her greatest joy, that my kindness had validated every sacrifice. She said she'd left me something important, not money, but purpose. I didn't understand then, focused only on memorizing her voice, her smile, the feeling of her hand in mine. That afternoon, while Mum slept, I discovered Daniel in Dad's study on a conference call about Mum's estate. He was discussing asset liquidation with someone using terms like anticipated inheritance and wealth transfer strategies. When he saw me, he didn't even look embarrassed. He said I was too emotional to understand business realities, that someone had to think practically. I left without responding, but something fundamental shifted. My brother had become a stranger, or perhaps I'd finally recognized who he'd always been. Margaret arrived that evening for her monthly obligation visit. She brought her newest boyfriend, a plastic surgeon who spent the entire time describing his innovative technique for lip augmentation. Margaret nodded along, occasionally glancing at Mum like checking a task off her list. When Mum's pain medication wore off and she moaned in discomfort, Margaret said she couldn't handle seeing suffering and left after 20 minutes. Her boyfriend seemed confused by the quick departure, but Margaret assured him Mum preferred limited visitors. The house felt haunted by absence. 22 rooms that once hosted elaborate parties now echoed with emptiness. The dining table that seated 20 gathered dust. The kitchen where Mum had cooked thousands of meals remained unused except for Maria's soup preparations. Family photographs lining hallways seemed like artifacts from an extinct civilization. We lived in a museum dedicated to a family that had never truly existed. Mum's final week arrived with subtle signals. She stopped eating entirely, even refusing water. Her breathing became irregular sometimes, pausing so long I'd panic before it resumed. She spoke to invisible visitors, carrying conversations with deceased relatives. Patricia explained these were normal end-of-life experiences, but watching Mum negotiate with death felt surreal. She'd argue with someone unseen, insisting she needed more time to complete something important. 3 days before the end, Mum experienced a final surge of energy. She insisted I help her to the desk, where she wrote one last letter with tremendous effort. She sealed it in an envelope marked, "Gloria open only after they know. Tyson." She made me promise repeatedly to honour her wishes about the letters, about contacting Mr. Thompson, about protecting what she'd built. Her urgency suggested these tasks carried profound importance, though I couldn't imagine why. Mum died at 2:17 on a Tuesday morning in June. I'd been dozing in the chair beside her bed when her breathing changed, becoming shallow and widely spaced. I held her hand and told her I loved her, that it was okay to let go, that I'd handle everything she'd asked. Her eyes opened briefly, focused on something beyond the ceiling, and she smiled. Then she was gone, slipping away as quietly as she'd lived, without fanfare or fuss, just a gentle exhale that didn't repeat. I sat with her body until sunrise, memorizing her peaceful expression, finally free from pain. Maria found us there, and cried harder than I did genuine grief from someone who'd truly known Mum's kindness. We called the funeral home, then I began the notifications. Dad answered on the third ring, sounded annoyed at being woken, then shifted to practice sorrow when he processed the news. My siblings responded with variations of finally disguised as "I'm so sorry." The funeral became a production orchestrated by Margaret, who hired an event planner to manage what she called the celebration of life. She selected the most expensive casket, the largest flower arrangements, the most prominent obituary placement, everything designed to project the image of a loving family mourning their matriarch. The hypocrisy made me nauseous, but I stayed quiet, remembering Mom's instructions about the letters. People packed the church, surprising my family who hadn't realised Mum's reach. Her volunteer colleagues, from the shelter nurses, from free clinics, where she'd secretly volunteered teachers from literacy programs she'd funded anonymously. These strangers knew Mum better than her own family. They told stories about her generosity, her wisdom, her quiet acts of kindness that changed lives. Dad stood stunned, learning about his wife's secret life of service. My siblings delivered eulogies. They'd clearly Googled generic tributes that could have described any mother. Daniel spoke about sacrifice without understanding its meaning. Margaret praised Mum's hostess skills and fashion sense, revealing how little she'd known her. Christopher sent a statement read by the funeral director, claiming urgent business prevented attendance. only I spoke from the heart, sharing the mother I'd known, the woman who'd loved fiercely despite receiving little love in return. The reception at our house felt like a business networking event. Dad worked the room discussing deals with colleagues who'd attended out of obligation. Daniel distributed business cards to potential clients. Margaret promoted her clinic to wealthy attendees. They used Mum's death as an opportunity for advancement, confirming every harsh judgment Mum had hidden in her letters. 3 days after the funeral, Marcus Thompson convened the family for the will reading. His office occupied a historic building downtown, all dark wood and leather chairs that smelled like old money. Dad seemed relaxed, assuming control of the entire estate. My siblings appeared eager, already spending their anticipated inheritances. They'd been discussing renovations to the family house vacation properties to purchase investments to make. None suspected what was coming. Mr. Thompson, a distinguished black man in his 70s, had known Mum longer than any of us realised. He'd been Thomas's best friend, maintaining contact with Mum for 50 years. His eyes held sympathy for me and barely concealed disgust for the rest of my family. He opened with standard legal language about Mum's mental competence and the will's validity established through multiple witnesses and video documentation. Then he dropped the first bomb. Mum's estate, which everyone assumed consisted of her jewellery and personal effects, actually totaled approximately $50 million. The room erupted in gasps and confused exclamations. Dad demanded to know where this money originated, insisting Mum had no independent wealth. Mr. Thompson explained that Mum had inherited a small amount from Thomas's military death benefits and life insurance, which she'd invested brilliantly over 5 decades. But the money wasn't the biggest shock. Mr. Thompson continued reading Mum's instructions. The entire estate would fund a charitable foundation called Eleanor's Hope, dedicated to supporting orphaned children and military families. Not one penny would go to Dad or my siblings. The family home, which Dad assumed he owned, had actually been in Mum's name for 20 years, transferred during a refinancing he'd signed without reading. That too would be sold for the foundation. The only personal bequests were specific and pointed. Maria, the housekeeper, would receive $1 million and a small property Mum owned in Florida. Patricia, the hospice nurse, would get funding for a grief counselling centre she'd dreamed of opening. Various volunteers from Mum's secret charity work received smaller amounts, and I would become the foundation's director with a salary and the responsibility to continue Mum's work. My family exploded in rage. Dad threatened legal action, claiming spousal rights to the estate. Daniel accused me of manipulating Mum into changing her will. Margaret screamed about undue influence and demanded a competency hearing. Christopher, participating by phone after learning about the meeting, cursed and threatened to destroy Mum's reputation if we proceeded. Their masks hadn't just slipped, they'd been completely torn away. Mr. Thompson remained calm, explaining that Mum had actually established the foundation 2 years before her diagnosis, making any claims of undue influence or incompetence impossible. She'd video recorded her intentions annually with multiple witnesses, including doctors, attorneys, and financial advisors. She'd anticipated every legal challenge and prepared accordingly. The will was ironclad, unchangeable, absolute. Then I remembered the letters. Following Mum's instructions, I retrieved the box from my bag and handed one to each family member. Mum had wanted them to understand why she'd made these choices, to know that she'd seen everything they'd tried to hide. As they read their individual letters, the room fell silent except for Margaret sobbing and the sound of paper crumbling in Daniel's fists. Dad's letter was longest, filling 3 pages with Mum's careful handwriting. His face went through a spectrum of emotions as he read. Shock, rage, humiliation, and finally something resembling regret. Mum had known about his affair with his secretary Sandra that had lasted 15 years. She'd known about the secret apartment, the jewelry charges, the weekend business trips that were actually romantic getaways. She'd forgiven him, but couldn't forget, especially when he'd stopped trying to hide it. Mum wrote about watching the man she'd married disappear into ambition and greed. She described lonely anniversaries, forgotten birthdays, countless nights wondering if he'd come home. She'd stayed initially for the children, then, from habit, finally, from resignation. But she'd never been the fool he'd assumed. While he built his visible empire, she'd constructed her own in shadows, using skills learnt from watching him, but guided by compassion he'd never possessed. The most devastating part revealed that the money Dad thought was his actually wasn't. Mum had discovered years ago that he'd been embezzling from his own company using complex schemes he thought undetectable. Instead of exposing him, she'd quietly replaced the stolen funds from her secret accounts, saving him from prison. She'd been protecting him while he betrayed her, showing a love he'd never earned or reciprocated. Daniel's letter exposed his own theft, though, from family rather than company. He'd been siphoning money from Mom's household accounts for years, assuming she wouldn't notice small regular withdrawals. He'd also convinced her to sign documents giving him power of attorney, which he'd used to attempt accessing her investment accounts. Mum had allowed the household theft to continue, curious how far her son's greed would extend, but had blocked his larger attempts through Mr. Thompson's intervention. Mum wrote about the baby who'd wrapped tiny fingers around hers, the toddler who'd called her mama, with such love, the boy who'd brought her dandelions calling them flowers. She wondered when that loving child had transformed into someone who saw his mother as an ATM. She didn't blame Jennifer or the pressures of success. She blamed herself for not teaching him that money meant nothing without humanity. Margaret's letter was shortest, but most emotionally cutting. Mum described watching her only daughter transform from a sweet girl who'd played dress-up in Mum's clothes to a woman who criticised everything about her mother. She recalled Margaret's childhood dreams of becoming a teacher like Mummy before Dad convinced her that teaching was for people who couldn't do better. Mum had saved every cruel comment, every eye roll, every time Margaret had been ashamed to introduce her mother to sophisticated friends. The letter's final paragraph destroyed Margaret completely. Mum revealed she'd been diagnosed with breast cancer 15 years ago, had undergone treatment alone, while the family remained oblivious. Margaret, the doctor, who claimed expertise in women's health, had never noticed her mother's suffering. Mum had beaten cancer then, without support or acknowledgement, proving she'd always been stronger than anyone imagined. Christopher's letter contained perhaps the saddest message. Mum wrote that he'd been her brightest child, the one she'd hoped would use his intelligence for good. Instead, he'd weaponized it for profit-destroying companies and lives for percentage points. She'd followed his career reading about hostile takeovers that eliminated thousands of jobs, about pension funds he'd raided, leaving retirees destitute. He'd become everything she'd tried to teach him not to be. Mum ended his letter with a challenge. She'd established a small account with $50,000 he could claim only after completing 1 full year of volunteer work with orphaned children. She wanted him to see faces behind numbers, to understand that wealth without compassion was poverty. She doubted he'd accept, but hoped the boy she'd once known still existed somewhere beneath the calculated exterior. My letter was different, filled with love and gratitude rather than disappointment. Mum thanked me for choosing kindness over ambition, for seeing her as a person rather than a servant, for those Sunday lunches that had sustained her spirit. She explained that the foundation wasn't a burden, but a gift, allowing me to continue the work she'd done secretly for decades. She'd been preparing me without my knowledge, teaching through example rather than words. The final paragraph revealed one last secret. Thomas had been an orphan raised in foster care before enlisting. His death had inspired her charity work, her way of honouring him by helping children like he'd been. The foundation would finally unite her two lives, the public widow of Richard Whitmore and the eternal lover of Thomas Chen. She asked me to ensure at least one child each year received a full scholarship in Thomas's name. After everyone finished reading, chaos erupted. Dad stood and walked out without a word, his usual composure shattered. Daniel threatened to contest everything to tie up the estate in court for years. Margaret collapsed in her chair, sobbing about being a terrible daughter while somehow making Mum's death about her own suffering. Christopher hung up after promising to destroy anyone who tried to claim his challenge money. Mr. Thompson let them exhaust themselves before delivering the final blow. If anyone contested the will or attempted to interfere with the foundation's establishment, he would release additional documents Mum had compiled. These included evidence of Dad's embezzlement, Daniel's tax fraud, Margaret's prescription drug abuse she'd hidden for years, and Christopher's insider trading activities. Mum hadn't wanted to destroy them, but she'd prepared for the possibility of their greed overcoming sense. The room emptied quickly after that revelation. My family scattered like roaches, exposed to light, each nursing wounds Mum had inflicted from beyond the grave. They'd attended her funeral playing bereaved family, but now they knew she'd seen through their performances. The letters hadn't just revealed her secrets, they'd exposed theirs, leaving them naked in their shame and greed. Mr. Thompson asked me to stay after everyone left. He pulled out an old photograph of Mum with Thomas taken weeks before he'd shipped to Vietnam. They looked impossibly young and radiantly happy, the kind of couple that made others believe in love. He told me stories about their relationship, how Thomas had planned to propose. When he returned, how Mum had waited by the phone for calls that eventually stopped coming. He handed me one final letter, the one Mum had written during her last surge of energy. Inside, she'd written about the strange journey from heartbreak to purpose. She'd lost her first love to war, her second to greed, but she'd found her truest love in service to others. She wanted me to know that wealth wasn't her real legacy. Her true inheritance was the knowledge that one person choosing kindness could ripple outward infinitely. The news of Mum's secret fortune and the family's disinheritance leaked within days, probably from someone at Mr. Thompson's office or the funeral home. The story went viral on social media with headlines like "Dying Woman's Ultimate Revenge" and "Millionaire Mother Exposes Family's Greed from Beyond the Grave." Reporters camped outside the family house trying to interview anyone connected to the scandal. Our private family dysfunction became public entertainment. Dad attempted damage control through his public relations team, claiming the will was fraudulent and Mum had suffered from dementia. But Mr. Thompson released one of Mum's video recordings where she calmly and clearly explained her intentions while displaying obvious mental competence. She'd even anticipated Dad's strategy, stating on camera that claims of mental incompetence would only prove the family's desperation. The public relations team resigned rather than continue the campaign. Daniel's attempt to challenge the will collapsed when forensic accountants Mr. Thompson hired discovered additional embezzlement from Whitmore Enterprises. Faced with potential criminal charges, Daniel agreed to drop all claims in exchange for the investigation ending. His wife Jennifer filed for divorce within a month, taking the children and whatever assets remained in Daniel's name. He lost his position at the company when board members learned about his theft, ending up at a small firm handling property disputes. Margaret's medical practice suffered when former patients shared stories about her callous bedside manner and dismissive treatment. Several filed complaints with the medical board about prescription irregularities, triggering an investigation that revealed her own addiction issues. She closed her Manhattan clinic and entered rehabilitation using insurance since her assets were frozen during divorce proceedings. Robert had apparently been planning to leave for years and seized the opportunity. Christopher experienced the most dramatic fall. The Securities and Exchange Commission, alerted by documents Mum had compiled, investigated his trading activities. While he avoided prison through expensive lawyers and cooperation agreements, he paid millions in fines and received a lifetime ban from securities trading. His penthouse was foreclosed, his cars repossessed, his carefully constructed life dismantled piece by piece. He moved to a studio apartment in New Jersey, working at an accounting firm for a fraction of his former income. Meanwhile, Eleanor's Hope Foundation launched with remarkable success. I worked with Mr. Thompson to establish the infrastructure, creating programs that addressed not just orphaned children's basic needs, but their emotional and educational development. We purchased a former private school campus, transforming it into a residential facility where children could heal and grow in a supportive environment. Every room was designed with love, every program crafted to nurture potential. Maria became the facility's house manager, bringing the same devotion she'd shown Mum to children who'd never experienced such care. She implemented Mum's recipes in the dining hall, ensuring every child ate nutritious home-cooked meals. She learned each child's name, their fears, their dreams, creating the family atmosphere Mum had always wanted in her own home. The $1 million Mum left her remained mostly untouched, Maria insisting she had everything she needed. Patricia used her funding to open the Grief Counselling Centre, offering free services to families dealing with terminal illness and loss. She named it the Eleanor Centre, placing Mum's portrait in the entrance with a plaque reading, "Love transcends loss." The centre served hundreds of families in its first year, providing support Mum had needed but never received. Patricia often said Mum's death had given life to countless others through the centre's work. 6 months after the foundation launched, I received an unexpected visitor. Christopher appeared at my office looking haggard and years older. He'd been volunteering at a homeless shelter, he said not for Mum's challenge money, but because he had nowhere else to go with his free time. He'd met children there homeless through no fault of their own and finally understood what Mum had tried to teach him. He didn't want the $50,000 he wanted to work for the foundation. I hesitated, remembering his cruelty during Mom's illness, his absence when she'd needed family most. But Mom had believed in redemption, in the possibility of change, even in the hardest hearts. I offered him a position teaching financial literacy to older foster children, preparing them for independence. He accepted immediately, grateful for any opportunity to rebuild his life with meaning rather than just money. The first Thomas Chen Scholarship recipient was announced on the anniversary of Mum's death. A 17-year-old boy named Marcus, abandoned as an infant, had maintained perfect grades while working nights to support younger foster siblings. The scholarship covered not just college, but living expenses, books, counselling, everything needed to succeed. When Marcus gave his acceptance speech, he cried talking about Mrs. Whitmore, whom he'd never met but who'd changed his life forever. Dad never contested the will, but also never acknowledged his behaviour. He sold Whitmore Enterprises and moved to Arizona, cutting contact with the entire family. Occasionally, I received reports from mutual acquaintances that he'd been seen alone at restaurants or golf courses, going through motions of a life without meaning. He'd gained everything he'd thought mattered and lost the only person who'd actually cared about him despite his flaws. Margaret completed rehabilitation and started working at a community clinic, earning a fraction of her previous income, but finding something like peace. She sent me a letter apologising for her treatment of Mum, acknowledging she'd become someone Mum wouldn't recognise as the daughter she'd raised. She volunteered at Eleanor's Hope, occasionally teaching health education to teenage girls in foster care. We weren't close, but we'd found a tentative understanding. Daniel disappeared from our lives entirely after his divorce. Last I heard, he'd moved to Seattle working at a small law firm and living in a modest apartment. His children, my nephew and niece, I barely knew, occasionally sent cards to the foundation. Jennifer had apparently told them about their grandmother's true character, wanting them to understand that wealth without wisdom was worthless. They seemed to be growing into better people than their father had become. 1 year after Mum's death, I stood in the foundation's main hall, surrounded by 43 children whose lives had been transformed. They sang Happy Birthday to celebrate the foundation's anniversary, their voices filling space with joy Mum had never experienced in her own home. Some were heading to college, others to trade schools, all toward futures that had seemed impossible before Eleanor's Hope. I thought about Mum's journey from a diner waitress in love with a doomed soldier to the architect of an empire built on kindness. She'd endured decades of emotional abandonment, terminal illness, and family betrayal, yet had responded with grace rather than bitterness. Her revenge wasn't meant to destroy, but to illuminate, forcing her family to see themselves clearly, while creating something beautiful from their ugliness. The locked room in our old house had become my office at the foundation. I'd discovered more documents there, revealing the full extent of Mum's secret life. She'd funded hundreds of scholarships, anonymously supported domestic violence shelters, paid medical bills for families facing bankruptcy. She'd been running her own foundation for decades without recognition or praise. The official Eleanor's Hope was simply making public what she'd done privately. I found love myself that year with Marcus Thompson's son David, an attorney who'd joined the foundation's board. He'd known about Mum through his father's stories, understanding her significance before we'd met. Our relationship developed slowly, built on shared values rather than attraction alone. When he proposed, he did so in the garden. Mum had loved promising to honour both me and her memory. Our wedding was small, attended by the foundation's children who'd become our true family. Today marks 5 years since Mum passed. Eleanor's Hope has expanded to 12 facilities across the country, helping thousands of children find families' education and futures. The foundation's endowment has grown through donations from people inspired by Mum's story, ensuring her work will continue for generations. We've kept her promise to help at least one child annually in Thomas's name, though we actually help hundreds. I visit Mum's grave every Sunday, maintaining our tradition of weekly lunches, though now one-sided. I tell her about the children, their successes and struggles, their gratitude for chances she'd made possible. I describe Christopher's transformation into a dedicated teacher, Margaret's quiet redemption, even Daniel's recent letter asking if he could volunteer. The family she'd lost had been replaced by thousands who carry her love forward. Maria still works at the foundation now in her 70s, but refusing retirement. She tells the children stories about Mrs. Eleanor, the lady who'd seemed ordinary but possessed extraordinary love. Patricia's Grief Centre has become a model replicated nationally. Mr. Thompson, despite his age, remains board chairman, protecting Mum's vision with fierce devotion. We've all become the family Mum deserved but never had. The house where I'd grown up was sold to a family with 6 adopted children. They've filled its rooms with laughter and chaos Mum would have cherished. The kitchen she'd cooked in alone now hosts family dinners where everyone helps. The garden she'd tended in solitude has become a playground where children chase butterflies. The transformation from mausoleum to home would have made her smile. Sometimes I dream about an alternate timeline where Dad had loved Mum properly, where my siblings had inherited her kindness instead of his greed, where she'd died surrounded by genuine grief rather than calculated absence. But then I see the children whose lives she's changed, the ripples of her compassion spreading infinitely outward, and I understand this was always her destiny. She'd needed to suffer to develop such profound empathy. She'd needed to be ignored to understand the invisible. Christopher recently shared something profound during a foundation board meeting. He said Mum hadn't disinherited them from cruelty, but from love. She'd known money would only amplify their worst qualities, making them more miserable. By forcing them to confront themselves without wealth's cushion, she'd given them opportunities to become better people. It was the most valuable inheritance she could have provided, even if most of them couldn't see it yet. I keep all of Mum's letters in a safety deposit box, including the ones she'd written to each of us. Sometimes I reread mine, finding new meaning in her words as I age. She'd known I would doubt myself, would struggle with the foundation's responsibility, would wonder if I was worthy of her trust. So she'd written reminders that love doesn't require perfection, only persistence. That kindness isn't weakness, but the ultimate strength. That choosing others over ourselves is how we become ourselves. The $50 million Mum had accumulated could have bought her a different life. She could have divorced Dad, travelled the world, experienced luxury she'd never known. Instead, she'd stayed in a loveless marriage, endured emotional neglect, and saved every penny for children she'd never meet. Some might call that foolish. I call it the greatest love story I've ever known. Not between Mum and Dad or even Mum and Thomas, but between Mum and humanity itself. As I write this, sitting in the office that was once her locked room, I can see children playing in the courtyard below. They're laughing with the abandon of those who've been rescued from despair. One girl, Sophie, waves at me. She'd arrived 6 months ago, silent and traumatized, convinced she was unlovable. Now she smiles freely, secure in the knowledge that she matters. She's learning violin, wants to become a music teacher. Dreams that seemed impossible before Eleanor's hope. This is Mum's true legacy, not the money or the foundation or even the poetic justice of her will. It's Sophie's smile, Marcus's graduation, the thousands of children who will grow up knowing love because a woman they never met chose them over her own family. Mum had discovered that the best revenge against those who'd failed to love her was to love others so completely that her life became proof of what they'd missed. I think about my siblings, often wondering if they understand yet what Mum had tried to teach through her final actions. She hadn't hated them despite their betrayal. She'd seen them clearly, accepted their limitations, and loved them enough to show them mirrors of themselves. The disinheritance wasn't punishment but education. The letters weren't weapons but warnings. She'd given them what they'd actually needed rather than what they'd wanted. The secret letter she'd written changed everything, just as the title of the story promised, but not in the way anyone had expected. It didn't just reveal her hidden fortune or expose family secrets. It transformed grief into purpose, betrayal into triumph, death into perpetual life through acts of love. Mum had written her own ending, authored her own legacy, chosen her own family from among the abandoned and forgotten. Sometimes people ask if I forgive my family for how they treated Mum. I tell them forgiveness isn't mine to give. Mum had already forgiven them, stated clearly in her letters, despite the hard truths they contained. What I can do is continue her work, ensuring that no child in our care ever feels the abandonment she'd experienced in her own home. Every bedtime story read every birthday, remembered every small act of love, is a victory over the indifference that had killed her spirit long before cancer claimed her body. The title of this story promised that Mum's secret letter would change everything, and it did. But the greatest change wasn't in the family who'd abandoned her, or even in the thousands of children her foundation helps. The greatest change was in me, transforming from a daughter who'd watched helplessly as her mother died unloved into a woman who ensures no one under her care experiences that isolation. Mum had given me more than money or responsibility. She'd given me purpose, the rarest inheritance of all. As the sun sets on another day at Eleanor's hope, I close my eyes and whisper what I tell her every evening. Thank you, Mum, for showing me that love isn't measured in presence but in impact. That true wealth isn't counted in dollars but in lives changed. That the best revenge against those who fail to love us is to love others so fiercely that our lives become testimonies to what's possible when we choose compassion over comfort, service over self, and hope over heartbreak. Her grave marker bears a simple inscription she'd chosen herself, Eleanor Whitmore, who learned that love multiplies when divided. But those of us who knew her secret know the truth. She wasn't Eleanor Whitmore, yea, wife of Richard and mother of ungrateful children. She was Eleanor, eternal lover of Thomas' mother, to thousands proof that one person choosing love over bitterness can change the world. What would you do if your family abandoned you on your deathbed? Most would succumb to anger, depression, or despair. But Mum chose differently. She used her final months to architect a revolution of kindness, building an empire of compassion that would outlive everyone who'd failed her. Her secret letters didn't just expose our family's sins, they revealed her own magnificent heart, too large for the small people who'd surrounded her. In the end, Mum had the last word, the final say, the ultimate victory. Not through cruelty or revenge, but through a love so profound it transformed abandonment into abundance, betrayal into blessing, death into eternal life, through the children who carry her name and mission forward. The family who'd abandoned her on her deathbed had no idea they were freeing her to become who she'd always been, meant to be a mother to the motherless, a voice for the voiceless, a love that death couldn't diminish. I close this story where it began with me, Gloria, 35 when Mum died, now 40 and guardian of her legacy. If you've stayed with me through this journey, you understand that family isn't defined by blood, but by who shows up when showing up is hard. You know that true inheritance isn't money but meaning, and you've learned what Mum taught through her life and death, that the best response to being unloved isn't becoming unloving, but becoming love itself so pure and powerful that it transforms everything it touches. Thank you for bearing witness to my mother Eleanor's story. If it moved you, if it made you think differently about wealth or family or love, then you've received part of her inheritance too. The part that multiplies when shared, that grows through giving, that proves love, is the only fortune that matters. Mum would have wanted you to know that you're worthy of love, that your kindness matters, that choosing compassion in a cruel world is the greatest rebellion possible. If this story touched your heart, if you've ever felt abandoned by those who should have loved you most, or if you believe in the power of kindness to transform lives, please leave a comment sharing your thoughts. What would you have done in my mother's position? How do we find strength to love when love hasn't been shown to us? Please like this video. If Mum's story moved you, subscribe to hear more stories of triumph over betrayal, and share this with someone who needs to know that their pain can become purpose. Remember, you are not alone, you matter, and sometimes the family that abandons us is making room for the family we're meant to find. Thank you for listening, and may you find the love my mother spent her whole life giving to others.